Of the Budget and Finance Committee. It's November the 15th. We have a quorum. Mr. Weezar, Mr. Koretz, Mr. Smith, myself, Bernard Parks, as the chair. Colleagues, if we could, a couple of items on consent. We have two items on closed session that are both workers' comp cases that basically followed the letter of the law on items number 1 and 5. If we can consent those, and it saves the city attorney from sitting through the meeting. And again, we will deal with the other 4 items in closed session. Also, on item 10, request a closed session, a consent item. It's information report that was requested regarding public service contracts. If we can move those.
I'd like to, but I had one question on 5. Can we, is the,
Okay.
someone from the department here? I just,
On, if it's regarding the case, we'd have to take it to closed session, so we'll
We
just
do?
take that one in.
all right.
Okay, so if we can do one on consent, on workers' comp. Okay. And we'll take the others. Let me just ask, I wanted to do 7, the CAO asked for additional time to determine when they will get back to us. And let me ask Ray, what kind of time on that item before we continue it?
You know what, can we actually just continue it and then hear it next week?
So we can hear it next week? Okay.
Yeah, and then we'll report back on timeline and more information, yeah.
Let me just ask, as you bring it back for next week, and that will be where you're going to give us a timeline?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, there's, it's 2 things, to see if we can add to our list of questions. One of them is whether there should be a consideration of this material being part of the RFP process, because on at least the underwriters, we go on a bench, and they apply and they sit there for a couple of years. If, rather than reporting annually, should it be part of the RFP process? Now, I'm not familiar with Treasury, do they use a bench? But at least with the underwriters, it would be somewhat of a different process.
So are you asking instead of being annually every 3 years, once every 3
Well,
years?
I think if it's part of that selection criteria, it would appear that that would be, if we're going to continue using the bench, that would be the most appropriate place to evaluate it. And whether then assess, do you need an annual report once you selected them? Now,
Okay.
if Treasury is using banks in a different fashion than the way they deal with it under underwriting, there may need to be another system.
Okay.
Okay. And then the final thing I had is just to add, although we touched on it on one of the requests, nowhere in the motion or the report or the draft ordinance does it ever outline the specific duties of the treasurer as it relates to the investment, what their fiduciary responsibilities are. So those are the 2 things I'd ask, and we hold that to next week to talk about time report back. Okay. Any other issues on 7B? We'll continue it for 1 week. Let me ask, we're going to continue, we have Tanua and Drash and Cecilia Romero. Would you like to speak on this or wait till next week? Next week's fine. Cecilia Romero? Is she here? Would you like to wait till next week or speak on it this week? We're going to continue it for 1 week. Pardon? Cecilia can come up and make a 2-minute comment, yes. And for those that are interested in this item, on next week, we're going to have the CAO come in and give us an idea of when they can respond to all of the issues that have been brought up. And from that date, we'll know when we'll hear the larger issues.
So like, Mr. Chair, there's 10 questions that we asked them to address,
Yeah, we just
and
added
we'll
12.
get those answers back.
Not next week. They'll
Right.
give us a date next week of when
Yeah.
they can respond.
Very good. Great.
Good afternoon.
Let me have the record, Mr. Rosendahl is with us.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Cecilia Romero. I am community member of LA Boys in Blessed Sacrament in Hollywood. We had last week, November 8th, a meeting with more than 826 people of all different faiths, Muslim, Jewish, Christians. And we were in the meeting to consider the passing of the ordinance in banking responsibility. And I'm here today to speak about this and how important it is for our community. We believe that if the banks invest the money in our communities, will be good for the betterment of the community. Jobs will be created when banks lend to small businesses. Also, affordable housing could be built if banks lend money to the people in the community. And we are here today to ask the committee to consider passing the ordinance. We are meeting with the different council members. LA Boys has different council members in their district, like Mr. Rosenthal, Mr. Garcetti, Mr. Wizard, Mr. Park, and we are asking you to consider this ordinance. There are being
Finish your thought.
ordinances similar to this one who are approved in Philadelphia, and the benefit for the community are great.
All right. Thank
For
you.
that, I thank you very much.
Thank you. And just for those that are interested, again, next week, this will be on the agenda, but only to allow the CAO to advise us of how long it will take them to report back. We will not be getting into the issues next week when that report comes back. That will be the discussion before the committee.
And Mr. Chair, on that same point about when they do come back, will they take up the Philadelphia plan and analyze it for us?
If you want to add that
I
as a
certainly want to
request.
make sure we understand the Philadelphia plan, what they've done, and how it works. Obviously, when that lady was here the other time and talked about living in her home for 17 years and paying her payments, I just don't want to mix apples and oranges and just propagandize here. Either we have a role in this that can be valuable or not. I don't want people misled, misrepresented. I'm fed up with that. I don't care if it's the federal level where these issues really need to be. I just want to know what role can we in this city play to support people in dealing with these banks. I mean, it's the simple question. This modification business, I've gotten lots of calls about it. I just want to make sure our city staff tells us what our options are in dealing with this issue. And I don't want people filling the room with a sense of that we can actually change things if we can't. Okay? I just don't want demagoguery around here.
Okay.
Okay.
Let me just ask if that, I think we have now up to 13 questions, and I can make that number 14. All right. So, Janine,
Hi,
Janine?
good afternoon. My name is Tanua Thrash. I'm here representing the Green Lining Institute. My brief comment for today, which I'll modify given that you aren't considering the matter today, is that we're a statewide public policy organization who has held banking institutions to standards ensuring that they're investing in low-income and minority communities. We support this ordinance, but we also offer to you and to the financial institution community our support in trying to understand a couple of the arguments that they've made. And our understanding is, one, that is an onerous activity for them to do, and number two, that it is cumbersome and that this information is already publicly available. We have extensive experience in collecting data like this and in analyzing that data across the state of California here, and we offer our support to this council as well as to the financial institutions in trying to identify the best source of information that should be made available on behalf of the city to support your constituents, as you've mentioned today, in whatever community development, home ownership, small business lending, and charitable efforts that you're expecting to have here in the city of Los Angeles. Thank you.
Thank you. And one of the things for those that are interested, one of the questions that we, or responses we asked the CAO to look into is on individuals and groups that came before the committee, that they reach out to them in preparing their response.
Great.
So we have your names, and they'll make sure that you are contacted as they develop the response for the committee.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Colleagues, one other item, number 11. My understanding is that although that's somewhat of a routine report, there are several of them in committee that, rather than deal with this one report, that we ask that we hold this for 1 week and bring all the reports forward at one time so that we're dealing with this whole issue of the Bureau of Sanitation's routine reporting. So if we can do that, Ray? Okay.
Yeah, is Bureau of Sanitation in the room? All right, the Bureau of Sanitation is in the room. I just want to thank them. Dion, I want to thank the Bureau of Sanitation for the leadership they've provided us in Venice, which has been a big issue with a lot of angry citizens. Bureau of Sanitation has done a significantly good job, and we're very grateful for them. And I want to make sure I go on the record with that.
And for the committee, I think the other reports are under CF number 10-1102. So we can bring all those forward and deal with them at one time. It would be helpful. Okay, we're going to go in closed sessions for items 2 through 6, and then we're back on regular session for items 8 and 12.
Yes, next items are actually both 8 and 9, I think, can be taken together. They are the Treasurer's Investment and Cash Management Report for the month ending July 31st. Item 9 is the Treasury Report, month ending August 31st.
Okay, thank you. And the record reflects we have a quorum, Mr. Kretz, Mr. Rosendahl, Mr. Smith, and myself, Bernard Parks, will reopen open session. I'm going to deal with items, 8 and 9 together. And also, if you could just give us, even though a couple of these reports are dated, if you give us also updated information as to where we are as it relates to our financial and investment portfolio.
Good afternoon, Steve O'Malley, Interim City Treasurer. And with me here is Tom, our Chief Investment Officer. The reports are dated, granted. The latest economic information shows that there's a potential for, hopeful outlook for the economy as a whole, but not necessarily for city investments. The last third quarter's GDP growth is up about 2% from last time. Last quarter, the second quarter was about 1.7%. Unemployment rate in LA County is 12.6. Unemployment rate in the state is 12.4, and the U.S. as a whole is 9.6. The inflation rate is pretty low, at about 1.1%, and as a result, the federal government or actually made an announcement on November 3rd that they would inject a little more money into the economy, about $600 billion. So we believe that would continue to hold the interest rates low. The only bad news for us is whenever the interest rates are low, our investments don't perform as well. And so as a result, what I've told you in the last 2 months is that our investment or our interest output is going to be much lower than expected. We expected that we would have about $12 million as a result of that. And
Go over it again. What was our original projection, and what do we think it's going to be?
$12 million for the general fund.
That was projected as of July 1st?
Yeah, that's correct. For the
Then what do we think we're going to hit?
Based on our balance and the low interest rates, we believe that's probably going to be $6 million. So 50% short.
Okay.
That's basically the economic outlook. And for the details on the two reports, which are pretty dated, Tom will provide you a little more information.
Good afternoon, Tom Juarez, Office of the Treasurer. As the interim treasurer mentioned, although the reports, as he said, are dated, the economic outlook really hasn't changed all that much in the last few months. GDP is expected to grow right around 2.5% for the remainder of the year and into 2011. That could be really due to the suboptimal unemployment rate, as Steve has mentioned, as abroad for the national. For the nation, rather, is somewhere around 9.6%, and is expected to stay around that 9% level through the remainder of next year. That being said, the capital markets environment is reflecting the less than optimal economic growth, and that is with the lower interest rates. Unfortunately for the city, we're investing at rates that are relatively low, well, about 1% lower than our initial estimates of last year. So that equates to about a 50% drop in our interest earnings forecast for this year.
Thank you very much. We don't want you to speak any longer because you've depressed us.
Sorry.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Parks, in that context, not them, but in that context, I have a feeling that the property tax revenue streams that we count on are not going to be as great going forward, and some people are not going to be able to pay their taxes, or they're going to delay in paying their taxes. So I'd like to get an update of where our sensing is about the revenue. Do we expect between now and the end of the year, or when do we get our piece of the property
I
tax?
think the bulk of our dollars come in the second and third quarter of the fiscal year. So the second, third quarter of the fiscal year. And I think what they told us on FSR 1 was that we found some extra property tax that was due to us from last year.
We had a little bit of carryover from last year. Basically, the property tax, we get our first payment, big payment. There's a couple that come in basically in July and August, but usually those are carryovers from the prior year. But December 20th is when we should have the information. From that payment, though it's not a final, we get some sense of what the collection might be. And then we get a little bit payment in January. That's the cleanup as well. The remainder will come in May. But with the December payment, depending on whether it's on track, and then we could get some indication as far as where collection will be.
And we're looking at FSR 2 in January.
No, actually, we want to have it out in December, and we would like to get it into committee and approved by council before the break.
Okay. So that would give us a little better sense on where we are on
Overall on revenues,
overall
yes.
revenue.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, we should get that next month. Okay. Thank you very much. We'll move those two items. Next, final item.
Okay, I think the last item is the Office of Finance report relative to background and recommendations for tax penalty waivers for the varying or different circumstances that a business may encounter.
Carl Sampson with the Office of Finance, and I'm here to report on this item, which was in response to the Claims Board request for background and any recommendations by the office for our penalty waiver process. As a matter of overview, essentially we're following the guidelines that were adopted by council in June of 2008, where the authority for any of the waiver decisions that are under $15,000 would reside within the Office of Finance and the Director of Finance, and that any items between $15,000 and $50,000 would be referred to the City Attorney's Office for review. And of course, any waivers over $50,000 would be for a Claims Board review, with any items over $100,000 to council. As part of that process in 2008, there was a consolidation of waiver reasons to 6 classifications from a variety of classifications. They consist of taxpayers not being aware of requirements and any associated delays that may be either due to Office of Finance, taxpayer, post office delivery, et cetera, as well as if the taxpayer was unavailable or if the records were unavailable. We also modified the guidelines at that time, whereas now we provide one-time waiver for any taxpayer that claim to have a lack of knowledge, and that amount is under the $15,000 authority. And if for any other reason, we evaluate those on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. Let me just, one of the reasons this came up in Claims Board is that it appeared as though when we dealt with reimbursements, or we were basically challenged by the taxpayer, that we would almost in every case give up the penalty and 100% of the penalty as long as we got the interest and the principal. Mm-hmm. And what we were asking to evaluate is that depending on how cooperative, how long the business may have been out of compliance, that there be some scale to say, well, if someone was in full, basically made a mistake or whatever, that may be 100% waiver. If someone was totally out of compliance, not cooperative, that may be no waiver of penalty. And that's what we're trying to get a gauge instead of everybody being treated identically. And I think from this, also the sense is that, in fact, tell us how many people actually would be making determinations as it relates to the penalty. Is that several dozen employees?
It depends. If the amount is an amount less than $5,000, there's a larger group that makes a determination on that. Mm-hmm. And again, it's based on if the taxpayer meets all of 5 criteria in order to make that determination.
Because again, for the number of people, I would not like to see us get away from criteria. Mm-hmm. I think if we left it open and it became individual assessment, then the Board of Review would probably get overwhelmed because people would assume that certain people were doing it subjectively. So I think we need to keep the criteria, and it should be internal. It shouldn't be where we are asking to put it in the ordinance. But one of the things I think that before we even get to the 5 criteria that, or the 6 that you've laid out, it seems as though that one that deals with, there's got to be assessment whether there was reasonable cause or a willful neglect right off the bat, mm-hmm. before you even get to A through F. Mm-hmm. And it seems like that needs to be a part of the assessment to see whether there was, reasonable, that any of these other below even should be considered. If it's just willful neglect, we shouldn't even get A through F. Mm-hmm. And so it seems like that needs to be put as the top consideration before we even go to that listing. And again, it should be internal, but we do need criteria. The other issue is that, I was going to ask you, is that on Code A, is that the only one that's a one-time only?
That is correct.
Okay. So the issue is that a person, and I don't know how often this happens, but on F, a taxpayer can come in multiple times and say, I've lost it, or my files were destroyed.
Mm-hmm. And again, that's probably very rare on occasion. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're talking about, if there's theft of records or destruction of records. Yeah. One of the things that we did along with this assessment is we conducted a study, a research of other taxing agencies in California. And so we surveyed 34 cities along with the IRS and both the Board of Equalization and Franchise Tax Board, and polled them to get a sense of what were their procedures and their policies that were in place regarding waivers. And generally, most of those entities don't maintain any written guidelines, and most requests are really evaluated on a case-by-case basis that we follow.
Yeah. And I think what we've seen on some of our issues, the Board of Review basically picks apart where they view that there's an inconsistency or they believe a subjective opinion of the individual auditor. Mm-hmm. So it would appear that it would be in our best interest to give our employees some guidance, mm-hmm. In the sense of dealing with it. But again, I'd like for the department to go back and look at this in the sense of, rather than getting rid of the criteria, is to improve the criteria that we have, mm-hmm. keep it internal, but also find a way to superimpose over all of these evaluations, the issue of cause versus willful neglect, so that that will be the number one criteria to go any farther.
And that's what we're looking at. What we want to do is, and again, after reviewing, again, what the agencies are doing, we want to be able to have that same, not using the specific guidelines, but being able to, review each of those requests independently, again, to determine the reasonable cause, and again, exclude those that are willful neglect in terms of approving. We also are recommending that for any requests that go to the claims board over $50,000, that all of those requests be automatically denied unless the taxpayer can explicitly bring proof that the Office of Finance or the city was the cause for that delay. And that we feel that any of those entities that are in that bracket or looking at a $50,000 penalty waiver, generally those are taxpayers that are in the range of $20 million in annual gross receipts, and they really should, have the resources and the wherewithal to comply with that.
Okay. So the thing is, if we could go, what would it take for you to kind of revamp this as relates to looking at the cause and the willful neglect as one of the primary issues, but also maintaining some of the criteria that we have, just to give guidance to the auditors and the folks that are going to be mediating these things, so that they aren't starting from scratch on case by case. So how long would it take to revamp that?
Well, I think what you're asking for is you're looking for really the written guidelines.
I think we need to keep
in terms of what determines what is willful neglect versus,
I think that should be the one that you have to determine before you go any farther. Because if it's willful neglect, I don't think you would be looking at code A through F.
Yeah, I think, what we're saying is that what we've been operating under is that, if there's a lack of knowledge on the taxpayer, we're still giving them that one-time exclusion, which many other agencies do.
Then it wouldn't be a willful neglect. See, I think that's the right reasonable cause versus willful neglect. If their person is unfamiliar and it's an honest mistake, then it would be reasonable cause. So that's what I'm asking, is that seems to be the criteria that should start off the discussion before we even get into any of the subtitles.
Okay.
And then the other one, if you could kind of look at Napa and San Francisco as some of that language, to just see if they kind of incorporate into what we currently have. But what would you need is time to kind of refigure that with the criteria, but also elevating the reasonable cause and willful neglect as one of the primary issues to look at.
Meeting after next.
Okay, you need a couple of weeks?
Yeah.
Okay, anybody got any other questions on this?
I think there's none left.
Okay.
Good, Doc.
All right.
Why did we decide to automatically turn down everyone over $50,000, and is there a due process question in doing so?
Well, I think, again, it goes to the fact that they really can't claim a lack of knowledge, being the size of business that they are, that they should be well aware of the penalty waiver or the penalty requirements within the city of Los Angeles. And it just seemed that for that size of business that, they should be aware of those requirements.
So could we not run into any kind of legal due process questions?
Well, I think that, again, the waiver is something that's incumbent on the city to offer. I mean, at this point, there should. I don't believe that's the case. I would have to probably check with the city attorney on that.
I would think we should probably have the city attorney look at that before we put that piece of the policy in place. So I appreciate that.
So with that direction, we'll give you 2 weeks and ask you to come back with that criteria. Before we close down, Mr. McQuiston, you have a card in for public comment.
Yes.
Good.
Today? 6th.
Jim, a question. I gave you a public comment on this because it
Go by the 6th.
could drastically affect our budget. I don't think this particular item has been thoroughly considered by the Rules and Elections Committee. And since I was in on the LAFCO problems heavily with the Department of Water and Power, it seems to me that this is something that we really have to think about. The budget for the revenue fund transfer is $232 million, and it's at stake here. Basically speaking, we have a Department of Water and Power which is wholly owned by the city, and we've told people, well, that's just an investment. It's independent of the city. We happen to own it, but we don't have direct control. We have commissioners who actually have the control, and we can't control the commissioners. Well, if we control the commissioners, then we don't have arm's length anymore. And then the question is, well, why are we getting the power transfer? And then we're getting that, as we said, in lieu of property taxes from this independent organization. That makes sense. But if it's part of the city, we don't charge property taxes for, let's say, the planning department. And the state constitution says that we can't overcharge people. If it's actually a part of the city, we have to give that money back. We can't keep it. So it doesn't make sense to go this far if there's another way. And what I've suggested here is the other way. There's actually a section 1346 of Title 18, which is very, very strict and very, very well used. And Mr. Barot, is very familiar with the city. If the city attorney had called him up and said, hey, put the arm on the DWP, we want that money right away, he could call him up and say, look, you want 30 years in Leavenworth, or do you want to return that money? Immediately it would have come back, and we wouldn't have had this paperwork problem. So I think there's another way of controlling it. We can also elect, essentially, just like every other stockholder elects a board of directors, and we can elect our own directors. So if we don't like them, the next time we have a board of directors meeting where the stockholder says, I want some new directors, and has a new slate, you can get the new slate. So I think that way of controlling the DWP is much more severe on them and much more quick acting than actually going to the citizens and saying, you really own the DWP, it's not our investment. And that's why I thought I should bring it up to the Budget and Finance Committee, because it does affect a tremendous amount of our budget.
Thank you very much. Any questions? There's no other items, no other public comment, the meeting is adjourned.